Welcome to week 2 of our Lenten study. We're looking at the authentic letters of Paul, and this week we're looking at the first letter to the Thessalonians and the letter to the Galatians. You'll notice as you read these yourself that they have very, very different tones, and a lot of it has to do with what was going on historically at the time. So let's first look at First Thessalonians. It's believed that it was written somewhere around 47. So it's the first letter that Paul has written. It's a very lovely letter. It's very relaxed. It's very open. It's celebratory. It's telling the Thessalonians how proud he is of them, how great a job they have done. And then he gets into a little bit of censor, and he talks about moral and sexual propriety and how to behave as Christians. One of the words that we encounter for the first time in First Thessalonians is the word fornication. And right away that brings ideas and images of what that could possibly mean. But it's really important to understand words in their context, not as they have come to have meaning in the modern mind. For us, fornication is sexually inappropriate behavior. It can look at a lot of different ways. In Paul's time, it meant something related, but quite a bit different. Fornix, the Latin word originally, was just the arch in a building. And in the first century, prostitutes would spend time in the arch, and that was where they would ply their trade. A lot of these places became brothels, so that's where they worked as well as got customers. It was a major part of the economics of the world. Greeks took it for granted that there would be people around, so did Romans. And it was primarily women employed and also young men. And there were all sorts of rules around it. They couldn't get married afterwards. They had to probably beholden themselves to the temple because temple prostitution was also something that happened regularly. So the priests in the temple, the priestesses, the servants or slaves that belonged to the temple, not only would they serve travelers who came to worship at the temple, but they would also provide a sexual service. So when Paul is talking, don't do this, don't be a fornicator, don't go with fornicators, Paul is not talking about don't have sex. Paul is talking about don't be engaged in exploitative sex. Don't be one of those people that abuses others for sexual privilege. And don't be one of those people that can be abused. One of the characteristics of the earliest Christian community is that they took care of each other. They referred to each other as brother or sister. In fact, one of the accusations, it would be several decades, probably generations after Paul, but one of the accusations of the early Christians is that they participate in incest because there were married couples in the church, obviously, but they referred to each other as brother and sister. So those who wanted to denounce Christianity as something horrid used sexual language and sexual innuendos to do that. And this was not just an accusation against Christians. This was a standard accusation, just like it is today. You want to undermine something, you accuse them of sexual impropriety. It happened in every culture as far back as we go with written language. It's not new. And it works. That's why we keep doing it. So Paul was specifically talking about exploitation in sex. And he warned the people in Thessalonica not to get engaged in that. Because remember, this is a Greek city. It would eventually become the head city of Macedonia. So it was a very important city. It was full of trade and travelers and very cosmopolitan. Very much like how Paul grew up in Tarsus. People of all different cultures and traditions and beliefs would mingle together. So he was trying to give that nascent Christian community some defining lines, some boundaries of what was appropriate and what was not. And fornication, sexual behavior, was one of the places he stayed at. Now, again, it's important to remember Paul is not a Puritan. He's not like the Victorians. That comes a lot later. Paul was in a culture where sex was just something that happened, and it wasn't that big a deal. But so he wanted to make sure that people didn't participate in exploitation. So that was a big part of Paul's message to the Thessalonians. But he also wanted to remind them that faith was the focus. Don't worry about getting caught up in rules. And there's a section um, in verse 2 where Paul sounds like he's very dismissive of the Hebrew community. Again, it's one of those situations where the word Jew is used inappropriately because Judaism didn't exist yet. Historically, we're talking Judeans specifically. So the people around the temple, the people who are doing practicing of the Mosaic laws, and insisting that that was the only way to have a relationship with God. So Paul is trying to separate the people that he is guiding in Thessalonica from this image of people who adhere to laws with the temple. It's often heard as a cry of anti-Semitism. And there's two problems with that. First of all, Paul was a Semitic person. Semitic wasn't just Hebrew. Semitic was generally a culture of people. Arab people are Semitic as well. It's part of the Mediterranean makeup, the cosmopolitan makeup that was there. So Paul was not talking about people who shared his faith or his belief or anything else. The other part of that is that we're not sure that Paul even wrote it. And this is where it challenges us and ancient scholars of ancient documents to figure out what is exactly original source, what is added and edited at the time, and what is put in after. The fancy word for it is interpolation. That's essentially someone further in history decided they needed to put something into the text because it fit their belief, but didn't necessarily believe the belief of who was originally writing it. And a good many scholars think this is what is happening with with these three verses in Galatians 2 that talk negatively about Judean folks. And one of the ways scholars have identified that or make that argument is the very end of it. It talks about the wrath, God's wrath and destruction. Almost every scholar agrees that that is a reference to the fall of the temple and the expulsion of the Hebrew people out of Judea and Jerusalem, which would become the diaspora. Paul was alive in the 40s and 50s. He wasn't alive in the 70s. So there's no possible way he could be writing about an experience that happened a couple of decades after he was dead. So we have to now look at it as, is this legitimate or is this trying to pursue an agenda? That's where it gets complicated for us because there was definite fighting and argument between the Hebrews and the early Christians in this time period after Paul had died. The seeds were being sowed by Paul and others because Paul was saying the rules of the Mosaic tradition are something we don't have to follow anymore. Faith is enough. Faith is what can get us connected to God. In fact, if you get distracted by the rules, you're really not close to God at all. And that would have really bothered a lot of the people who followed the temple tradition. Add to that Christians of the day saw themselves as pacifists. They did not get involved. They saw Jesus going to his death passively as an example of how they should go to their own death. And we get a whole history of martyrs and people who went gallantly to the cross or some form of execution. So they did not fight when the Hebrew people rebelled against Rome. They weren't there. There's good suggestion that they weren't even in Jerusalem at the time. So that level of betrayal, because remember, we're still talking people who are friends of each other, who are each other's families, who are just a couple of generations removed from each other. So the connection is pretty close for some of them. That level of betrayal obviously led to a lot of anger. I mean, wouldn't you, if you were trying to fight for something and this group of people who was expanding and growing all the time, who said they didn't like Rome, still didn't do anything about it, and you were the one that was caught and tortured and your family was the one kicked out, that's a lot of resentment. So the thought is that later generations of Christians actually inserted these passages or three verses back into Paul's letter where it hadn't been there in the first place, because of the anger that they were enduring as they were reading it in the late first century, early second century. So that's just a little bit of the challenges that scholars have in working with historical documents. But the letter or the first letter to the Thessalonians itself, it doesn't have a particularly harsh word in it. Just a gentle reminder, stay the course. Our God is love. We are all together. There is nothing that separates us. There a level of inclusion, and how Paul misses them, and how he's looking forward to seeing them again. Now, of course, there is a second Thessalonians, which we've already established is not an authentic letter of Paul. So we're not going to look at that. We'll just stay with First Thessalonians. And then if you go chronologically, the next letter to look at is the Galatians. And you notice we're flipping back and forth in the Christian scriptures quite a bit, because the way they are set out, all the letters, Paul's, the pastorals, the additional letters, is they go from the largest, which is the letter to the Romans, down to the smallest, which I believe is Jude. They're not in chronological order. It wasn't an issue for early Christians, and quite honestly, given the richness and the efforts that Paul put into the letter to the Romans and the two letters to the Corinthians, most of our scripture, most of our theology comes out of there. So it kind of makes sense. So the Galatians is larger than first letter to the Thessalonians. And right away, you're going to discover an incredibly different tone. This is angry Paul. This is Paul who is wondering where these people went wrong. They didn't write to Paul. He's gotten wind of them falling away from the way he was teaching them, and he is not happy. Scholars put this one somewhere between 47 and 52. And in the handout, I go into why that is a bit of a mishmash and trying to figure out where we date things. And scholars do this all the time. They look for cues in the verses themselves, just like in First Thessalonians about the wrath of God. Well, that's a historic cue or clue that they use to date. When it comes to the letters to the Galatians, we're not sure if it was written before the Council of Jerusalem or after the Council of Jerusalem, whether it was written to the southern Galatians or the northern Galatians, because unlike Thessalonica and Corinth and Rome, Galatia was a region. It wasn't a city, so we can't pinpoint who it's from. The other challenge, as I mentioned last week, when we're looking at the story of Paul, we've got the legend of Paul in the book of Acts, and then his own letters, which don't have a lot of biographical information. So the Council of Jerusalem, the only information we have about that is found in the book of Acts. So how historically accurate is it, because it's rehearsed decades later? That's an open question, and one we're not going to get into. But these are some of the challenges, again, that come into dating. So Galatians is assumed to be the next letter in our chronology of 7, but it's got about a 10-year window where it could have been written. And in this period of time, we can see very huge differences in how Paul is articulating theology. There's not much theology in Galatians, which makes sense, in 1 Thessalonians, which makes sense if this is just 15, 20 years after the death of Jesus, and the Christian church is still trying to figure out what it believes, how to put language around this, how to put some praxis to the promises of Jesus in eternal life, what that looks like in a practical way. Very, very new thought on that. Whereas when we get to the Galatians, there has been more happening, and it sounds like there has been some arguments along the way, people traveling around with different messages. Now, this was a problem in the early church right across the board. In fact, by the time we get to the end of the first century, the Christian church is kind of still figuring out what to do with theology and our belief in Jesus and the Trinity and all that kind of stuff. It still hasn't been worked out, but What has been worked out is a church order. And this is who in charge, and this is how you spend money, and this is who is responsible for money, and this is how you treat guests, and this is how you know whether they have authority. So the early church was trying to really solve that problem, the practical problem of their emerging tradition. Paul's letter to the Galatians kind of fits right in the middle of the century. And so already we're having this experience, we see this experience of two different messages going out. And traditionally we recognize those two messages as one from Paul and one from Peter. That Paul had a mission to the Gentiles, that Peter's mission was to the Hebrews. And Paul talks about how he and Peter, or Cephas, he uses the word interchangeably, have met up, but they don't travel together, that Peter did not influence Paul's understanding because he got his revelation straight from God the same way Peter did. So Paul sees them as equal as far as legitimacy to the authority. But not all people would see that. There was already a history where the apostles, the 12 named apostles, or the however many apostles there were, that were taught by Jesus directly. Remember, Paul claims that he saw Jesus after his resurrection. So he was not there in the early days of Jesus talking to his closest Hebrew followers. So this tradition that the apostles were the ones who carried Jesus' message was starting to gain strength. So Paul was dealing with people who would come and basically upend what Paul was trying to teach them as far as how to go about becoming followers of Christ. What are the parameters? What are the processes of doing this? And one of the big issues of that time was, do they go to Jesus through the Hebrew tradition, or do they go directly from where they are to where Jesus is? Paul, of course, argues they go directly. They don't have to take a bypass through the Hebrew tradition. And whoever spoke to the Galatians said that was the way it actually had to happen. So Paul was livid. He was not only livid at this person, but he was also livid at the people of Galatia who listened to it. And why were they not paying attention to what he had very clearly explained? So we start to have a theology of equality being worked out through Paul. And we get to Paul in verse 3 giving what is believed to be the first creed of the church, that there are no Jews and Greeks, of course that's Judeans and Gentiles. There are no slave and free. There are no male and female. Everybody is on equal footing when it comes to approaching God. Now, that's a revolutionary process. Not only are we talking people whose entire ethnic and geographical identity is based on being children of the promise to Abraham, going through the laws of Moses and doing all the things at the temple. That was where the exemption was from Rome destruction. So these people were heavily invested in that being the process, and Jesus being one of their own, that would continue. Paul was invested in something else. He was invested in bringing a message out of that tradition, moving beyond so that people around him would understand. And you have to remember, Paul, growing up in Tarsus, he grew up around these people. This was reasonable to him. He probably wouldn't see any particular argument that would justify separating people from what he considered this life-changing announcement, this message that he was given, that converted him, that changed him so completely that he did a 180 from persecuting these people to being one of the best known missionaries in history. And Paul would have learned in the Greek rhetorical tradition as well as in the Hebrew faith tradition. So he was melding these parts in himself, let alone in the wider community. Even though he talks about himself in Galatians as being full of zest, he was well educated, but he did not see the need to deny his his wider Greek heritage. And one of the claims, of course, Paul, of course, is that he was really a Roman citizen. He wasn't really a Hebrew inheritor of the Hebrew tradition. So he had to clear that up from time to time and identified himself with the tribe of Benjamin, which we discussed last week, whether or not that was historically legitimate or not. That gave him a sense of legitimacy. So Paul, in that education system, that rhetorical system, brought an argument that the Hebrew people in the Mosaic tradition were not using. They were just using inheritance, that they followed the line through. Paul was using language that was compare and contrast. Very, very different way of doing things. And unfortunately, in Galatians, one of the compare and contrast that Paul was using was how the Hebrew people were too closely connected to tradition and laws, and that was not how you're going to get there. And again, we've got to be careful of the anti-Semitic interpretation. That comes later in history. That is not something Paul put on them. He was just using the devices that he knew how to use to make his argument, because he didn't have an inherited authority like Peter did. He didn't have a first-person authority like like James, the brother of Jesus, had. He only had the authority that he claimed from being the last witness to the resurrection. So he had to show the people in Galatia, probably the wider Mediterranean world that he traveled, that authority was sufficient. And in order to back that up, to reinforce that authority, people didn't have to go through the tradition or go through the rituals of the Hebrew tradition. They could go straight to worship of God, even though he acknowledged that he himself had scars. Now, whether the scars were his circumcision, because he was born Hebrew, whether his scars were some of the abuse he experienced in prison, it's an open question. But he acknowledged that he had a new revelation. It wasn't to follow in the Hebrew tradition, and he didn't say that was bad. He just said there's another way too. And this is part of what spurs the drawing of the lines between the people who would eventually follow the Pharisees and become Jewish, and the people who would follow Paul and other Christ followers and eventually to Christianity. There's a reason there is tension between these two right from the beginning, as we've looked at a few times. It's legitimate, but it's not something that Paul encouraged or started. He was just a product of his time, like we all are. So he used the tools he had. And unfortunately, in this compare and contrast, in order to make his side look better, he has to naturally denigrate the other side to a certain extent. So we're caught in that bind, but we have to look at it in the context of the day, not what further history would look like. And in the middle of that, and in his dealings with Peter, we come to find out that Paul thinks Peter is a bit of a hypocrite. Now, tradition holds that Peter didn't get along with Paul, or vice versa. It also holds that Peter didn't get along with Mary Magdalene. They were both seen as heads of the followers of Jesus at the time. So Peter, I don't know, what do you say about Peter? Not my favorite person in the Bible, for sure. He seems to have a lot of conflict. He seems to have a lot of arrogance. And Paul calls him out on that. And he talks about Peter's hypocrisy. That there's an incident that happened in Antioch. And he uses this argument with the people in Galatia, saying, all those people who said that we follow Peter and we have to make sure we're part of the Jewish tradition. Even Peter didn't follow that. When he went traveling outside of the Hebrew territory, he ate with whomever. And it wasn't until other people from the Judean provinces came and stayed with him in Antioch that Peter walked that back. And rather than being a really helpful guest and just accepting the generosity of the host, he insisted these Gentile people in Antioch serve him according to the Jewish food purification laws. Now that's a hardship. I don't know if you are familiar with them. It's so much easier today than it would have been back then. The Hebrew tradition in Galilee and Samaria and Judea, they were used to it. That was how they did things, but not in the wider Gentile territory. They ate things that would not be acceptable. So by deciding on a dime to turn, Peter was actually putting greater stress on his hosts. And Paul thought this was horrible, that this was a reason to show that we have to get over that concept that we cannot be outside of the Hebrew tradition and follow a new path where all are inclusive, where all are equally in God's presence. Paul had a very plain argument. It's the continuing theme throughout all of his letters, and in fact, it's the continuing theme through Christian history, and that is that our salvation comes through faith. Now, I want to highlight this. We're not talking individual salvation that a lot of conservative folks get into arguing. This is not about mea culpa. This is not about ourselves. This is about corporate salvation. So none of us get in there until all of us have this experience. So part of the Christian tradition, of course, is the evangelical arm of convincing more people to get on board with this message. So it'll speed up the second coming, and it'll speed up us being community worthy of what God envisioned for us. Paul says our faith is the only thing that gets us there. We don't have to do things. We don't have to dress a certain way. We don't have to eat a certain way. We don't have to adhere to certain laws. We just have to have faith. That does two things. One is it frees up people to develop their spiritual relationship with God. Second, it trips up people who want structure. It's so much easier to say, on Sunday I do this, and on Monday I do this, and on Wednesday I wear this. That structure really helps people organize their life and faith. Paul stripped that away from everybody. He wanted them to live on faith alone, to believe on faith alone. That was the only thing that mattered. So Christians fell away because it was so much easier to be given a series of tasks to do. Faith alone is actually a really, really hard thing to do. It sounds really simple, but it's not. And Paul kind of knew that, I think, and that's why he reinforces it all the time. But that's why we get why the tone in Galatians is so much different, because he is just so frustrated at these people who take what he thought is a pretty clear-cut message and stop following that and go to others to have verification that following the rules, following the laws of Moses is the real way to go about it. It's really tough for Paul in this situation because, again, he doesn't have a community behind him. He's doing solo and picking up people where he goes. And his opponent are the people who come with community and come with proof that there's another way of doing things. Paul does his best, but we have to allow him his anger that people are not getting the message. This is also the book where Paul gives us the most biographical information going. We don't know much about Paul, but we learn a lot of it from Galatians. So this is who we're working with. Next week, we're going to look at the 2 letters to the Corinthians, and we're going to tackle that biggie about no women speaking in church, which I hope these last 2 weeks have kind of pointed out that there must be something else going on there, because Paul's behavior and treatment and his creed does not support silencing women. And we're going to, especially by the time we get to Romans, see all the women Paul is thanking for helping him in his ministry. So something else is going there, and we'll unpack that. See you next week.